Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Harbors of the Sun by Martha Wells. Okay, so as far as I know, this is the latest in the Books of the Roxura series. But having read it, I am nowhere near sure this is the last in the series. And I really hope it's not. I want more books. But this book picks up almost exactly where the last, The Edge of Worlds, left off. There's a couple of days time skip, but we are clearly in the next scene that would have appeared if it were all one book. Because of that, there will definitely be spoilers for the previous book, like my synopsis will be nothing but spoilers for the previous book, and likely there will be spoilers for the rest of the series as well. Now that that warning is out of the way, The Harbors of the Sun starts with several characters kidnapped by the Hyans. The Hyans have stolen the artifact that the Roxura accidentally carried out of the ancient Foundation Builder city. The Hyans discovered ancient writing before the story even started in their homeland that said the artifact was a weapon that will kill all the Fel. But it also said that the reason the Foundation Builders never used it was because they realized that it didn't just kill Fel. It would indiscriminately kill anyone descended from the Forerunners or the Foundation Builders, which would include all Fel, Roxura, and a good portion of the Kish Empire. Probably millions of people. Moon, Stone, Jade, and all the others are chasing the Hyans to save their kidnapped friends. But along the way, they will discover that their rescue mission is about saving far more than any individual. This is about preventing a genocide. Okay. So, first of all, most of my comments on The Edge of Worlds came down to that book was oddly structured because it just felt like the first half of a book. And yeah, here's the other half. This one could literally be taped to that one, with maybe two reminding you what happened in the last book kind of paragraphs cut, and it would read as one extra long book. Which is why the first book felt like really all build-up. But oddly, this book actually had the opposite structural problem. Now I want to say, because I'm going to harp on this for a while and I just need to explain things, but before we dive into the rest of the review, I did love this book. Most of my experience with it was very happy. I am just fully aware that there's a structural problem, and I enjoyed breaking things down, so I'm going to be talking about it a lot. Now, there's a point about 100 pages from the end where this book should have stopped and a third book should have begun. The Edge of Worlds and The Harbors of the Sun should have just been a trilogy. This book has a very clear climax, a bit of falling action, and then we start another plot. Now, it is still part of the same story. It's not like it's completely disconnected from the rest of the book, but the first 300 pages are all about saving the captives and stopping the genocide. The last 100 pages are about Moon and Kish and the fallout of what happened in the Cloud Walls. We should have stopped after the weapon was dealt with. Now, I would have been an emotional wreck if the book ended there, because it would have been a serious cliffhanger. But I would have simply bought the next book immediately and made a short video screaming about how I need to read it as soon as possible. But as is, we get an entire new environment, new species of people, new characters, at least one of whom I really liked and would have liked to have spent more time getting to know. We get new emotional arcs, and yeah, we get a new plot. I would have loved to have read an expanded version of that plot. An expanded exploration of Moon finding himself alone again, surrounded by distrustful groundlings. Basically, back where he started the entire series, but as this entirely new Moon that has developed across the series. And get it? Bad pun. New Moon. Okay. I would have also just loved to have seen more of him trying to deal with that. Also, there is definitely an entire book's worth of material in the story of the Roxura as a species dealing with this giant empire that is on one of their borders. Though I honestly didn't realize until that section that Kish was that close to the Reaches. But like, I'm not a huge fan of political machination plots, and that's what this would have been. But the story of a species that is seen as basically dangerous animals, but with this immensely complex internal structure and political culture, dealing with a vast empire with greater firepower and huge numbers, could have been a fascinating story. And I mean, we do get that story in this book, but it's just a very abbreviated version. We get 100 pages to cover brand new emotional arcs, the political arc, a battle, and all the chaos left over from everything that has come before. It's a lot in not a lot of page length. And because this entire Kish and Aftermath part of the story is currently part of the climax of the Harbors of the Sun, we have to rush from one high-energy, action-packed scene to the next. First of all, that means we just don't have a lot of time to explore nuance. It feels rushed. But it also starts to feel a little bit bland, because we are trying to stay at the same high-stakes, climax-level energy for 100 pages. There's also this really interesting emotional arc going on in the last 100 pages, and the characters just don't get enough time to settle in and explore it. Especially Moon. The arc is all about Jade's feelings about what happened to Moon in the Cloud Walls, and Moon doesn't even have the slightest idea or the slightest chance to know that something is up until we are basically in the falling action. I feel like the entire emotional arc would have been so much stronger if he had had the chance to really have his own emotional response before the last 2 pages of the book. Which he would have had time if those last 100 pages had been expanded to a full-length book. Wells would have had the time between the fight scenes, the passing out, and the political standoffs for him to think about what had happened in the Cloud Walls, to make guesses about the bits he did not know, and to have his emotional responses to those guesses. And I really think it would have been as cathartic and powerful as his emotional arc in the Siren Depths. But as is, most of that arc had to be resolved in the falling action. And emotional arcs resolving in falling action, it's fine. A lot of books do so rather than having them resolved during the action's resolution. Honestly, a lot of books use the emotional arc's resolution as the bulk of falling action. An example of this is like The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, which has this big dramatic fight scene as the resolution to the action, but the major emotional arc is that of Amina reconciling her desire to be a hero and an adventurer with her desire to just be a good mom. That arc is mostly resolved after all the fighting, the swearing, and the magic is done. It is resolved in the bit where the characters are just hanging out on the ship, talking, decompressing, and Amina realizes that going out to sea might just be part of what being a good mother to her daughter looks like. And that's fine. It feels organic and gives that falling action scene, which would otherwise be a bit empty, a solid purpose. But I feel like in this particular book's case, it would have just had a bit more punch if the emotional arc had grown evenly alongside the plot of the book, which it can't do when the spark for the entire emotional arc happens 100 pages from the end of the book. Also, there's just the fact that Moon waking up in Kish felt so much like the beginning of another book. So yeah, basically, one of my only complaints about this book is it just needed to be longer. I needed more book. It does make me wonder if this was a publishing choice, because, like, involving agents and editors and all of them people, because Wells does not strike me as an author who would ever choose to give her readers a quick, bare bones, jumping from one action scene to the next kind of story, when a full, complex, multiple-layered, roller coaster kind of narrative could exist. But I also just really hope that this is not the last book in this series, because there's so much more left to explore. Even if it comes in the next book rather than as part of this one, I would still love to read a Raxura in Kish trying to get the Empire to see them as powerful allies kind of story. They could go back and do it again, it's fine. I still want to know more about the evolution of the Forerunners into the Fel and the Roxura. And specifically because I have a theory about that the progenitors were originally an outside influence who controlled the Fel evolution, which is why the Forerunners saw them as sort of an enemy. But that is something that's just headcanon. I would love to see it either confirmed or denied. I would also love to see what happens with Constellation and her flight in the Reaches. Another thought that I have is, of course, I have this theory that there's a story coming, or at least a story possible, between Constellation and Shade. I feel like there is still a story in what Chime's place among the Roxura and his connection to the Forerunner magic is. Especially considering there's just the hint of a resolution to that question in this book, and it's just enough to make me want so much more. But I feel like the way the courts interact with each other in this book could spell big changes to the Reaches, and I would love to read stories about that. And ultimately, in the end, I just want more. I do feel like Moon's personal journey has been completed, but because the last two books have opened up to several other characters' POV, it would not feel out of the blue or wrong or like cheating for us to get other books in this series with different protagonists. But overall, I just love this book. The overarching plot did go where I thought it was going, and where I felt it needed to, exploring the Roxura's place in the overall weave of cultures of the three worlds. But it also surprised me. It did some things I did not expect, and it did some things I did expect in different ways than I expected. The whole world, the setting of the Cloud Walls was fascinating and unusual, and managed to do some really interesting things. I honestly am surprised that this book was not named after the Cloud Walls, though I'm guessing that's just because it would be too similar to the first book in the series, The Cloud Roads. But I will say that if I got my way and this magically became a trilogy, the last three books, instead of a duology, I would say that the middle one needed to be named The Cloud Roads, and we could save the Harbors of the Sun for the last book. But also, I will say, some of the first climax, for lack of a better description, is so complex that I got a little bit lost. Specifically as to what was happening when, and therefore what caused what actions. It's one of those climaxes that involves 7 million characters, some of whom are together, some of whom are on opposite sides of, like, the structure, each of them doing things that only they could or would do. Each action has these huge implications for all the other characters in the other parts of the world, and basically everyone is just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. A few characters have less impact, but they all have a part, and because of that, there's just a lot going on. Much of it at the same time. It's one of those climaxes where you're getting like 10 minutes in one character's POV, then the same 10 minutes in another character's POV, then the same 10 minutes in another character's POV, then you jump back and get like 20 minutes in another character's POV that covers that same 10 minutes, and then you get another character's POV that is maybe 10 minutes after, but it's just a lot, and it makes it a little bit difficult to know exactly which bits line up in the timeline. And because of that, there are some things I'm still curious about. For example, I'm not exactly sure what stopping the boat did to the inside of the flower dock. Which is one of those sentences that will only make sense if you actually read this book. But I would also have just loved a moment where someone basically just synopsized the events in linear time after the fact. Which would have been another benefit of splitting this into 2 books. We could have spent some of the time in the exposition of the final book with the characters putting together a timeline of events. Which, if it was Moon doing this, he would have been doing it on his own, which would have also given him the time and the reason to have an emotional response to what happened on the Cloud Walls, and to give him, like, a chance to brainstorm, and so Jade's emotional arc would have had more power. But as usual with Martha Wells books, this one had amazing world building, fascinating, unusual settings, creative species with an array of different cultures that built on each other and challenged each other. It had likable, believable characters who grow and develop and have powerful cathartic journeys. It had about 7 million things going on, and was actually much better balanced than the previous book at knowing what information we as readers really needed to know and when we needed to know it, versus what could just be an intriguing, unexplained bit of world building. And on that note, there is a line in this book that read to me as sort of Martha Wells' sort of statement of philosophy on her world building. And that is, Moon mentally sorted it under things with no explanation that were interesting to look at and not particularly dangerous. And yeah, I think that's the author poking fun at herself a bit, but it's also what makes these books so much fun. Sometimes we just get things that are interesting to imagine, but not actually driving the plot, never explained, and not technically necessary. And it makes the world feel so real. It feels like there are stories behind every detail that we pass, reasons things exist, histories, lives. But we don't need everything to be explained. Sometimes the trees are farming fungus and have eyes, and that is in no way relevant to the story, and that's just like how sometimes in the real world, you walk by a tree that's covered in graffiti carved into the trunk, but none of the words have any meaning to your life or your story. And it's just a reminder that the world is bigger than the story being told. Now, hilariously, the thing Moon is referencing in that quote actually ends up being very dangerous and deeply interwoven into the climax, and at least partially explained. But I still think that quote is deeply relevant, because a large portion of the beauty of Wells's world building is how much she doesn't explain, but you feel have an explanation. How much is just there. And objectively could have been cut, but would have left the world a much duller place if it had been. Basically, I love this book. I just wish there was more. More of this book, more of this series, more in this world, more Martha Wells. Luckily, there are still the 2 short stories collections, which I had assumed were dessert, and I now realize should have been treated as a between courses palate cleanser. And I still haven't started Murderbot, Martha Wells' other best-known series, and there are a couple of standalone books of hers I have not picked up, and other short stories. I'm always happy to discover a new favorite author, but I absolutely love it when I discover a new favorite author who has an extensive backlog of works. So even if this is the end of the Books of the Roxura series, I have a good bit more Martha Wells to read. But I still hope it's not the end. Please write more.